there! I didn't see you there. Hello, Oscar Ward students. Welcome to Herbology 101. This is week 2 of summer reading, and today we're going to introduce you to some of the native medicinals that are growing probably in your backyard. Right now we're just down at the Parks and Rec area, and there's a ton of stuff here, so we're just going to walk through and look at some of these things, talk about some of their actions, and maybe that'll give you some confidence to explore a little bit on your own. If you're interested after this herb walk in learning more, you can also check out our collection on herbalism, which we have several different books about herbal medicine and identifying wild plants of the Northeast, so you can always check that out as well. But why don't you come a little bit closer and we're going to talk about some of these things that I've found while I was perusing over here. So this one right here is called sweet fern, and this is young sweet fern. So usually an older, more mature plant is going to have a woodier spine. That means that their stem, and so it would look brown here, but this is a young one, so it doesn't have that wood, that kind of woody stem yet. But if you look over here, here's one that's more mature, and you can see what I'm talking about over here. So sweet fern actually is a very storied plant. The indigenous people of this area would use it and burn it in fires to repel insects. They would also use it to make a tea. They would also use it for smoke cleansing rituals. When the colonials arrived, they decided that they were going to use it for tea. So here's one of the leaves, if you can see. That's what it looks like. When you rub it, you can actually smell the fragrance. It's very aromatic. And so they actually used this when the Brits weren't allowing tea into the colonies. They would make tea out of this so they could get their fix. But they also used it for seasonings. They could dry it, and you can use it as like a seasoning for like poultry or fish. But perhaps its most useful quality is its ability to heal the skin, the affinity for the skin. It's really great if you have poison ivy to take a bunch of this. You can use it fresh or dried, and you can make a tea out of it and then pour it into the bath and soak, and it will help heal your poison ivy and stop the itch. You can also make a salve out of it. You can also just make a poultice, which is basically if you take the leaves and you just kind of crush them up and then stick them on there, and that will help with the kind of horrible itchiness of poison ivy. So it's a very useful plant. It grows very abundantly here, and if you keep your eyes out, you'll probably see it. So it's perennial, which means it grows back, so you don't have to worry about over harvesting too much. But of course, if you do want to try taking some of this out of the woods by your house and into your kitchen, you probably only want to harvest a third of what you see. That way you leave some for nature and some to keep growing. So also in this patch, right next to the sweet fern, we have some blackberry. This is a young one, so it doesn't have any berries yet. There's a whole lot of it over here. Let's see if we can find one that has some berries on them. Here's some. So this is we have several different species of wild blackberry and raspberry that grow here. It's just bramble. You have to be careful about the blackberry because it has spines underneath the leaves. But the leaves are very helpful because you can use them for your skin also. Really good to turn into a tea if you have a sore throat. It's really high in tannins. Tannins create a drying sensation, so and they also close up any of the kind of open or inflamed or kind of weeping tissues. So when you have like a sore throat, they're really good because they help tighten that up and provide relief. They're also great, like I said, for skincare. Actually, recently, some of the most recent research has shown us that it's actually great for anti-aging, but you don't have to worry about that because your skin is still beautiful because you're young. But those are some of the properties of blackberry. You can dry it, you can harvest these leaves anytime. A lot of people like to harvest them in the spring before the fruit starts growing, before it flowers, but you can really harvest it anytime. Just be careful about those prickles. because they'll get you. It's pretty thorny. And I would even probably cut the leaves like away from that prickly spine and dry those. You can dry them for about 2 weeks and then crush them up and make a tea out of them or whatever you would like. So yeah, that's blackberry, and like I said, that grows everywhere. And here at the Parks and Rec little field down here, there's a ton of it. So next time you're down here, keep an eye, see if you can identify it. Let's see what else we can find in this little patch. What's this? So I'm trying to see how many pine needles are in a bunch. That's not, this must be a pitch pine. I'm looking for white pine. So white pine will have in the bunches like of needles when you pull them off. There'll be five needles. Red is 3-ish. Sometimes it can be not 3. So they used to say like white or red pine, like how many letters are in what is in the word white, and that's how many needles and how many letters in the word red. But when you have other pine trees around, they don't necessarily play by those rules, and so sometimes that can get tricky in identifying it. But most pine needles are very nutritive and we think high in vitamin C. So nobody has yet done the scientific research to figure out if there is in fact vitamin C in pine needles. But we know from the indigenous tribes here, when the colonists came that were all struggling with scurvy, the native people taught them how to make a tea out of pine needles to cure scurvy. So we think there's probably a good chance there's some good vitamin C in there. A traditional beverage that they would make was filled with boiled pine needles, and then they would boil it in maple sap. So it was like a really good sweet tea, and pine kind of has it's got kind of almost like a citrusy tartness to it. So it's really good, and that is another thing that you can try if you're feeling brave. Don't feel like you have to go harvest maple sap, because it's not exactly the time of year for that. But you can just boil it in some water and add some maple syrup and just, feel like you're way back then in the olden times, curing your scurvy. It's a magic scurvy potion. So you can carry that one with you in your pocket. Let's see what else we can find. I think there's some yarrow over here. Oh yes. I'm looking for some that has flowers, but if you want to come here, we can take a look at this. I'll pick a leaf here. This is another one that grows almost everywhere. It's called yarrow. It's got these very feather-like leaves. The flowers are like white. They're like little bunches, little clusters of white flowers. And the flowers are used, the leaves are also used, but the flowers are preferred because they taste better. Not a very tasty plant, gonna be honest. Not super tasty. However, it's very useful, especially for wound care. It's a styptic, which means that it can stop bleeding. So if you find yourself stranded in the woods on a nature hike gone wrong and you're bleeding profusely, find some yarrow. You can again boil it, make a tea out of it, put that tea right on, or you can crush it up, make a poultice out of it. People use it for tea, people use it for, it's used a lot by women for women's maladies. But it's highly useful, and it's also great for your lungs and for moving mucus out of the lungs. So that's probably one of its most common uses. And once upon a time, many hundreds of years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, there was a European herbalist who compiled a lot of the kind of herbal lore and information that we have now and that people have continued to look at in order to inform our usage of plants. And one of the things that was talked about was what they call the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures suggests that there is an interesting kind of wisdom in plants, that the way that a plant looks, whatever body part it resembles, is what it's probably good for. Now again, this is just a fun piece of lore, of herbal stories. And since our theme is imagine your story, we're gonna imagine some herb stories right now. But it is interesting that you'll notice a lot of herbs that are good for that, for moving, you know, mucus out of the lungs, that are good for the lungs. They have a kind of capillary look to them. So like your lungs are filled with little tiny veins and little sacs, and so these, you could imagine, kind of look a little bit like a lung. And so that's one of the ways that you can identify herbs and guess what they're good for. Although I would not advise using them unless you research them first. But it's fun nonetheless. So let's see if we can find anything else that's interesting. Maybe we will happen upon some yarrow flowers so I can show you what those look like. I think I saw some. Let's see. I know there's some goldenrod somewhere when I was down here. Oh, St. John's wort! Yay! Oh, this is exciting. All right, want to come up close to this one? This one has a lot of lookalikes and a lot of poisonous lookalikes, so this is an advanced gatherer plant. However, St. John's wort is full of fun stories. So the way that it got its name is that it usually was harvested on the summer solstice in Europe. They would have huge bonfires and these giant festivals to celebrate midsummer all over Europe. And because this plant was always in flower around that time, they would go out and gather all of this plant on the summer solstice. Now the summer solstice also happens to be St. John's Day in the Catholic calendar of feasts, and so it became St. John's wort, named after St. John. In the British Isles, they also call it St. Columba's armpit pack. That's the modern translation of the kind of Gaelic name for it. But it was associated with St. Columba, who is the patron saint of Scotland and Ireland, one of the patron saints of Ireland, and is one of the folk heroes who features prominently in folklore of the British Isles, so that's a fun one. It's super sunny and it is very well researched. It is used for so many things, but it does have a lot of drug interactions, and so again, this is an advanced for an advanced herbalist to use. But it can be made, the flowers can be picked and turned into an oil that can be used for topical pain, or if you're just feeling the blues during our, you know, half of the year that's winter. It's also good for lifting the spirits if you rub a little bit of that oil on you. So that's St. John's wort, super cool, one of my favorite herbs. Oh, here's some yarrow, the flower. It's kind of sad. I think something ate part of it, but that's kind of what it looks like. And you can see these ones are bigger, so you can see those, that pattern, those kind of feathery leaves. Alright. I'm getting bit by things out here. Should have burned some sweet fern while I was walking around to keep the mosquitoes away. They love me. Tough. Let's see. Oh, some wood sorrel over here. We've got tons and tons of these brambles, these blackberry bushes back here. They're just totally loaded. You should zoom in on these. Totally loaded with blackberries. Very high in anthocyanins, which is that, gives them that dark black color. Super good antioxidant, very healthful. good for the circulatory system and just general health. Relieves oxidative stress. Let's see, what else? What else? What else? I think we're almost done. You guys are doing good hanging in there. I know it's boring, herbology, but it's gonna be good because we're also gonna make some fun things with some of these plants once we gather them. Let's see. Here we go. This is the last thing and then I will let you guys go. But this one is one you're probably pretty familiar with. It's all over the place. It's just starting to blossom right now. There's lots of different species. It is one of the most hybridized plants in the Northeast. They suspect there's over 250 separate species of goldenrod here. A lot of people think that this is what's responsible for the allergies that attack us from this point on until fall. But it's actually usually ragwort. It's actually very rare for goldenrod to cause people allergies. It happens, but it's pretty rare. But ragwort, which often grows with goldenrod or near goldenrod, is the culprit. It's very allergy inducing, and so that's usually the bad guy. It's also useless and fairly poisonous, so not my favorite plant if I'm honest. But this guy is actually really cool. So goldenrod actually has tons and tons and tons of these tiny, teeny tiny little blossoms. Can you come get a close up? I want to pick it. Come look at these guys. Teeny tiny yellow blossoms, and they're really cool because they just do so many things. So really similar to yarrow, they're often used to clear out, to resolve excess mucus. Also a diuretic, so good for people who are looking for kidney support. I made my dad a tincture of this last year when he had kidney stones to help clear out the kidney stones, and it worked. But can be a little bit drying, so because of that, since it's a diuretic. So I also made sure that he drank lots of water. But the Latin name for goldenrod is solidago, and solidago, it means heal all. So it's basically just heals all the things. It's a styptic as well. It's great for wound care, great for allergies. People use this a lot for seasonal allergies because it dries up the kind of nasal passages when you're having just too much of that. And it's a very supportive herb. There is one kind that grows native here, if you can find it, that's sweet, and it's got a little bit of a licoricey scent to it. So if you take a leaf and crush it, you'll be able to smell it. This isn't it. Doesn't smell like licorice. Dang. But it's always fun if you can find it. The flowers and the leaves, basically all above ground parts, are used, but the flowers taste the best, and you can use them in a tea, and you can dry them for use later on, or you can make all manner of things out of them fresh. But yeah, there's quite a bit of difference between the different species. There's so many different kinds, but you can recognize them by these like beautiful teeny tiny little baby flowers. There's a whole bunch over here that hasn't not yet quite bloomed. So yeah, so that was our herb walk. Again, all of these plants we just found wandering around the Parks and Rec area, so I encourage you to get outside and find a good field guide book where you can kind of look at some of these wild plants and you can identify them and go home and learn more about them. We are so lucky where we live because it is just bursting with amazing plant allies that have so many awesome uses. One of the things that I didn't even get into was there's like flower essences. It's like another thing that people make with that, and it's kind of fun, where you kind of infuse the wisdom of the plants into water and preserve it to give you kind of a boost to that wisdom yourself. So that's a fun tradition that exists. That's fun to look into if you're interested in that. And if you feel like, you know, putting some of that in your cauldron, it's always fun to do that too. It feels very magical. Goldenrod is very good for in the world of kind of Bach remedies, which is flower essences, it's used to give you a nice strong backbone. So if you feel like you could use a little backbone, maybe you want to start hanging out with some goldenrod and see if you can take on a little bit of that strong backbone. Very useful. I could have used some of that when I was a teen. But yeah, so that's it for this. Our next video, we'll be making some fun various potions and preparations. So yes, our next class is potions class, and we'll be taking some of these wild herbs that grow around us readily and we'll be transforming them into some very fun potions. Maybe we'll do an anti-scurvy potion and some other fun things, so stay tuned for that. We will have herb kits available for that, so keep an eye out for notifications on when those will be ready to pick up. And otherwise than that, I just encourage you to get outside and get exploring. Bye, Oscar Wart students. Until next time.